Reading is like everything else in life. When I was exercising this morning, I had this thought, and it occurred to me that this is very much the case, that reading is like everything else in life. And what I mean by this in specific was, if you think about temptations and how they arise and other things that you do in your life, well, temptations also arise in a reading life or a reader's life. And there are different kinds of temptations that arise. So, temptations that arise from, like, let's say you're bored, or let's say you have like an impulse. These kind of temptations that stem from a negative place. But then there are temptations that kind of stem from a positive place, which arguably are harder to resist in some cases because they're associated with virtuous things, right? Putting down a book and like flipping through your phone is a temptation, but it's a bad thing. We view it as a bad thing. It's not a virtuous behavior, and so it's kind of more easy to spot, easier to identify, and easier to resist. But the kinds of temptations I have in mind that come from reading are things that are harder to resist by virtue of the fact that they are behaviors that aren't necessarily not virtuous, but in fact can even be virtuous. So to understand what I'm talking about, let's start with the first example, which is a temptation fueled by ambition. Anybody who's made a reading list will immediately realize that you can get way too ambitious with your reading lists, and you can form lists that are way too big. And this is a temptation that, yeah, it can be virtuous, right? Set big goals, and when you set big goals, if you fail short, you still failed pretty high, right? Aim for the stars, land on the moon, this kind of meme. But I think it's also to be said that ambition can be like the wings of Icarus, and when it comes to reading lists, if you make a list that is too big, you can actually, as a result, not read any books. You can completely fail because you'll set your goals so big that you get discouraged, you kind of get burned, and then you don't read any books. You just stop reading, you give up. So there's a temptation in that sense where, as a reader, you can get way too eager to read more books. You can create a reading list that is way too big. I know me personally, what will happen is I'll be reading books, and let's say I'm reading like a Steven Pinker book, okay? And Steven Pinker mentions like another author, or maybe mentions, in specific this actually happened where I was reading Pinker and he mentioned Charles Darwin and the expression of emotion in man and animal, and I hadn't found that book yet, and when Pinker mentioned it, I immediately put down the book, went into Amazon, and bought Charles Darwin's book, and I was excited to read that book. That slowed down my reading of the Pinker book, and that was obviously a temptation of ambition that I gave into, and I think it was a net negative for reading. So temptations of ambitions are one example. Now another one would be temptation fueled by pleasure. This one can be virtuous, but also can be bad, right? In the sense that not many people will tell you, for instance, going and buying books is a bad thing. Very few people will tell you that. In fact, if you break your monthly budget by buying books, many people will say, well, at least you bought books, right? They'll say it's a good thing in general. But as a reader, buying too many books can be bad. I personally have adopted the view that I'm a collector as well as a reader, which is how I actually justify buying so many books. But I do recognize that it's not a good thing to buy more than you can read in general. And this would be like a temptation fueled by pleasure, which can lead to bad outcomes. I mean, just think of the example of a budget. If you're trying to set monthly budgets and you keep blowing all your money on books, you're going to make the source of your pleasure, books, become a negative thing, right? And so this temptation by pleasure, or by going to buy books, is another thing that happens when you're a reader. You want to buy more and more books, and it's not a good thing. Now, another thing that happens with me that I've noticed, for instance, is eagerness, temptation by eagerness, right? So if you have a temptation that's fueled by eagerness, when it comes to being a reader, it can equate to things like skipping subjects or skipping mandatory reading or prerequisite reading. A terrific example of this would be, for me, accounting or finance. I definitely want to read more advanced accounting and finance, but I find myself, like, especially when the more rudimentary stuff is boring and it is more obvious, like exploring what a bond is, exploring interest rates, different types of interest rates, etc., right? When I try and start with the rudimentary stuff can be boring, and so I get eager, and maybe I want to skip some prerequisite books and jump to the more advanced stuff in finance and accounting. The same thing can happen with mathematics or philosophy. I do notice people do this with philosophy, which is bad, because in philosophy what you can do is, like, since there's no, technically speaking, a technical barrier right? Most of the advanced writers like Kant or Hume or arguably even Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, they explain their ideas inside the books that they're writing. But if you skip the introductory textbooks to philosophy, then you'll miss the whole kind of contextualizations of what these writers are doing. And as a result, your eagerness might have actually led to you misunderstanding or having kind of like a step up, right? When, say, for example, Thomas Aquinas makes his famous initial mover arguments. If you read a textbook, you understand that he's engaging in like the metaphysics of causation. But if you just simply start with Aquinas, you might think he has a persuasive argument, and you won't have the ability to contextualize him in the context of, oh, this is a metaphysics of causation argument. Whereas instead, you're just going to be stuck with, oh, this is a causation argument, right? You don't have that context of it being in metaphysics. So temptation by eagerness can actually be bad, and it can make you skip ahead of things like mandatory reading. Now, the last one that stuck out to me in particular was temptation fueled by excitement. So what I mean by this is, if you're reading a book, let's say you sat down today and you said you were going to read for 3 hours or you're going to read for 4 hours, you're really going to commit to reading today. This thing can happen where you get an idea and you want to go and implement the idea, and as a result you put the book down. So let's say you get 45 minutes into reading, then a great idea comes across, you abandon reading for the day and you go and try and implement that idea. Or you get so worked up about the idea that you actually just, like this happens to me, you're still holding the book open in front of you, and maybe you're actually reading, but you're just thinking about the idea, or maybe you're holding the book in front of you and you realize like that you haven't been reading and you're just thinking about the idea. The excitement associated with the ideas you can get from books can distract you from the actual task of reading. And I would say that this is like a temptation from excitement, which is, again, if you contrast that to like a temptation from boredom, you could see how it's different, right? Because no one's going to tell you that it's bad to be excited about ideas. It's like a virtuous thing actually to be excited about ideas. Whereas people will tell you, do not get distracted while you're reading, in the sense of like going on your phone. Like if you're bored, just keep persevere, they'll say this to you. Nobody will tell you, if you have a great idea, keep reading, right? So there's different temptation categories, you could say, that aren't black and white. I'm sure there's some intermingling. For example, I think you could easily say that an eagerness and an excitement for ideas, these temptations could easily intermix. Yeah, it's not black and white. Just there are probably archetypal categories that you could use. And in addition to like this archetypal categories and like this temptations that are virtuous and temptations that are bad, you could keep in mind that the general idea here is to consider that these temptations that are virtuous, right? Like, oh, you're excited about an idea. That's great, right? That's a wonderful thing. If you get too bogged down in even those positive temptations, your source of reading, or like the pleasure you derive from reading, can become a bad thing. It can become a net negative, right? And you don't want that. The best example was like if you're bored and you have nothing to do on the day, well, you as a reader might say, well, I love going to bookstores. And so you go to a bookstore and then you blow your money on books. This is a bad thing. If you spend all your reading time, if you have a goal for the day of reading 40 pages and you spend 2 hours of the 3 hours you had just thinking about an idea or like implementing an idea, okay, now you're behind on your reading goal, source of unpleasure. There are positive temptations, just like everything else in life, there are positive temptations with reading, and you need to avoid them even if they could be quote-unquote virtuous. With that being said, bye-bye.